In an earlier reminiscence about Ardh Satya, that's a half-truth, a 1983 film by Govind Nihalani, I had conflated the grayness and moral ambiguity of the violent murder at the end of the film with the astonishing half-truths that we, as a nation, have encountered in the pandemic's oxygen tragedy, the illegal Pegasus surveillance, and the vaccination promise made to our citizens. However, there is another insidious half-truth embedded in the narrative of the film, the Ardh Satya of discretion and discrimination used by the state to annihilate innocent victims. While an abusive use of the state's discretionary powers is well documented, for example, how civil rights activists are vindictively and tragically, whimsically, they are incarcerated under sedition and anti-terrorism laws. What often escapes public censure is a similar violence of discretion and discrimination that's inflicted on economic actors. Very few people are either aware of or they muster the courage to protest the ill treatment of business entities, perhaps because it's almost intellectually fashionable to clobber all commercial activity as venal. So this state excess gets a free ride despite being almost as destructive. When you think of state excesses, what instantly springs to mind is the Cairn Energy tax imbroglio. Now, nationalist Indians are incensed that a rapacious foreign corporation, it's popularly rumored to be a tax dodger, has the temerity to file a petition in global courts for seizing $1.7 billion of our government's assets, including residential properties in Paris and Air India's planes parked overseas. Now, an angry chorus of how dare they, this drowns out the half-truths of discrimination that may almost justify, yes, I say this at the risk of being trolled, almost justify the Indian government's indictment. Just consider the facts with a cool head. Cairn Energy made a highly risky and hugely successful bet on exploring oil in Barmer in Rajasthan. Now, India celebrated as Cairn's oil fields spewed hundreds of millions of barrels of black gold from the desert's bowels. Then, in 2006, Cairn restructured its business operations in India. At that stage, no adverse tax demand was raised on them. 5 years later, in 2011, Cairn sold its operations to Vedanta, but retained about 9% in the company. Even at this stage, the transaction was hunky-dory. Then, in 2012, the Congress-led government, stung by a heavy loss in the Vodafone tax case in Supreme Court, they authored a very soured, a very retributive law which allowed it to extract retrospective taxes going back half a century. It was a calamitous use of the state's discretionary and discriminatory powers, perhaps the most dangerous Ardh Satya on taxation propagated by any government in independent India. What followed was nothing short of legally sanctioned dacoity. A capital gains tax of 10,200 crores was slapped on Cairn Energy in 2015, 9 years after the restructuring event. Interest and penalty were added to fatten the demand. Next, the government seized Cairn's residual stake of nearly 9% in the Vedanta acquired company and then forcibly selling those shares in 2018 and expropriating dividends and tax refunds amounting to over 2,700 crores, even as the matter was under adjudication. Naturally, Cairn Energy took the Indian government to international arbitration, where our Ardh Satya was ruthlessly exposed. Even the Indian government-appointed arbitrator ruled against us. But the Indian government continues to defy, arguing that its sovereign right to tax cannot be subject matter of international litigation. While I concede there could be a half-truth in the government's assertion of sovereign taxation rights, the way Cairn Energy was assaulted has handed the moral baton to the beleaguered foreign entity. Now, the best the Indian government can hope for is a half victory, i.e., it should settle honorably with Cairn, but continue to assert the sovereign right to tax, but that should be done fairly and transparently. There is much back thumping since Flipkart, the Indian, is it Indian? Well, the Indian e-commerce giant has vaulted to a $37.6 billion valuation, with the company raising $3.6 billion in cash and SoftBank re-entering the capital table. Quicksilver nationalists are applauding. See, in less than 3 years, our homegrown e-commerce hero has created wealth of over $15 billion. Oh no, that's a bit of an Ardh Satya. Yes, of course, it's true that Flipkart's valuation has leapt from $22 billion in 2018 when it flipped out of the Indian founders, that is the Bansal boys' hands, into American Walmart. That's correct. But then even then, excited nationalists had claimed that $16 billion, the largest ever foreign direct investment, will flow into India. But I had to bust that myth because 14 billion out of that 16 billion was Indian wealth that was drained out to America, China, Japan and South Africa. Only a relatively paltry 2 billion had made it to India. Why? Because in our nationalist wisdom, we had unleashed our formidable agencies to investigate fraud in a fledgling Flipkart, hounding the founders out of the country. Ultimately, Flipkart's ownership was flipped to Singapore in October 2011 to save it from the vagaries of India's half-baked exploitative laws. So when the time came to encash the value via the Walmart sale, India lost while the rest of the world gained. A similar phenomenon is playing out now. This massive accretion of $15 billion in less than 3 years is being soaked up almost entirely by overseas shareholders. So the wealth is being created in India, but it's enriching non-Indians. Poor India will only get a relatively paltry $3.6 billion in primary capital that will be invested here, while all the ballooning gains are parked overseas. Why again? Because we shall continue to suffer from the original sin when we forced the first generation founders of Indian unicorns to relocate their companies in other lands, creating an Ardh Satya or shadow of foreign residence.